Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today's show, trade wars. The presidents of America and China staring each other down. Who'll blink first? Well, we're going to be looking at their weapons of financial destruction, their armory, trying to predict who's going to win. Plus, who started it? Trump's critics, of course, blame the president. Others say China's been playing unfair for years. And is it worth it? China may buckle in the end, but in the meantime, farmers are telling us they're suffering. All that and more coming up right now, right here in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore, and today in the Nexus, it's President Trump versus President Xi in what's being called the biggest trade war in history. Well, they call it a war, of course. That's not the case. That's just how financial journalists describe it to get our attention. It's hardly Vietnam or Iraq, is it?
Importers that cheat. They're cheaters. From now on, those who break the rules will face the consequences, and there'll be very severe consequences. They've been killing us. $507 billion in trade deficits last year. 507. Who the hell can lose 500? Then you want to do something about it and you get attacked. Oh, that's not nice. That's not free trade. So we're not starting a trade war, but we'll finish it.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here. It's real. At the stroke of midnight, the U.S. hit China with tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods.
Trade war. Trade war. Trade war.
China immediately responded with its revenge tariffs of equal value, accusing the U.S. of launching the largest trade war in economic history.
President Trump is putting a lot of pressure on them, and, there are signs that
China
they might
has more
crack.
to lose in a trade war with us than we do.
But a trade war ultimately will be bad for everyone.
So the longer this trade war goes on, the risk of longer-term damage.
I'm not sure who's more vulnerable, but both sides are going to lose.
They could cause further retaliation, and a trade war will be devastating for U.S.
Both
consumers,
sides
investors.
have so much
China
to
calls
lose.
the threats of blackmail, but there's still time
Trump,
to negotiate.
on the other hand, doesn't bother to look to see if we have a surplus or deficit. Their leaders are smart, and our current leader is pretty dumb.
We are going to make trade fair and reciprocal. Reciprocal, you know what that is? They do it to us, we do it to them.
Well, it's a good time for financial journalists, isn't it? You've got a president like President Trump ramping it up. Greg Swanson, you've been in the financial industry for many years. Sometimes I feel a bit sorry for these financial journalists. They're trying to pump up the story.
Yeah, they tend to exaggerate a little bit. I prefer to use sports analogies, and I try to frown on the war analogies because it's probably disrespectful to people who've actually been in a real war.
Yeah,
whether it's civilians or military.
You've got these financial correspondents pretending they're war correspondents all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's not exactly Desert Storm. I think people should probably temper that a little bit.
Steve, I want to just come to some of the hyperbole. For example, the South China Morning Post or whatever it was, it said it's the biggest trade war in history. Does that bear up to scrutiny?
Well, I think the use of the term trade war really is not terribly helpful. Trade should not be about war. These should be completely separate things. Normally, countries trade in order to improve economic exchanges and relations and benefit mutually. But since we're talking about a situation where two countries are trying to confront each other in terms of the economic relationships, I think that's where they actually meant it by trade war. And if you are using terms like trade war and whether it is the biggest ever, then you also have a situation that money has become much bigger figures now than it was 20 years ago or 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And therefore, if in the gross terms, of course it's the biggest ever. But it means absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Howard, if I can come to you just to introduce you to our viewers. You're a farmer. You're joining us from Florida. You got up very, very early in the morning to join us on the Nexus today. I do appreciate it. I want to ask you, although it's true that the financial journalists are pumping this up with their use of language, it isn't a war, but it does have real-world consequences for people like you and other farmers and their livelihoods.
Most definitely. The larger farmer will be able to hold out longer than the smaller farmer.
This is where the problem is going to occur. How long can we hold out with this tariff war? As I said earlier, aluminum and steel is already being showing up on the farms now with the prices. That's just compelled what we're doing with the farmers now. Soybeans, now it's really going to be a problem with the small farmer, much more than the larger.
Of course, it's not just the financial journalists who are dramatizing and using hyperbole. I want to show you a character you should be aware of here. Behind the scenes, we've got a guy called Peter Navarro there on the left. He's the Director of National Trade Council. In other words, one of the top advisors to President Trump on trade. And just like the man to his right there, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, he's very hawkish on China. Now, Peter Navarro made a documentary before he got that cabinet post, which is called Death by China. Let's have a listen.
Hi, I'm Peter Navarro, Director of Death by China.
The film you're about to see addresses one of the most urgent problems facing America. Its increasingly destructive trade relationship with a rapidly rising China. As you watch this film, it is important to always distinguish clearly between the good and hard-working people of China and their repressive communist government, now victimizing both American and Chinese citizens alike.
Help defend America and protect your family. Don't buy made in China.
Let's go back to Greg Swanson. Greg, it looks like Donald Trump has surrounded himself with people who are very stridently anti-China.
Well, I think that he makes some good points in the clip, and also the administration has made some good points. Look, I think everyone can agree that China cheats, China steals, China violates trade agreements. Just ask the WTO. There's been 16 complaints by the United States against China to the WTO, and the U.S. is 16 for 16. So something tells me that the China trade platform is broken and it needs to be fixed. Now, I think a lot of conservatives and capitalists and businessmen would prefer, and I would definitely argue farmers, would argue that, you know, that the trade fight should be directed at China, not at our other trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and the EU. Let's focus on China. I think that's where the focus should be.
Let me go back to Steve. Steve, in the academic community, how well regarded is Navarro?
Well, not in the Chinese studies community. In the Chinese studies community, he is not taken very seriously. I think when you are dealing with economic relationship with China and trading relationships, Greg is absolutely right that China does not play fair. There are very serious issues in terms of the economic and trade relationships between China and the U.S.
Yeah, we'll come to that a little later in the show. Well, thank you for that, Steve. Now, which country, the United States or China, has the most financial firepower in this war? Let's open up their armories, and to do that, we're bringing back a classic many of you liked in the early days of the Nexus.
USA, China.
Welcome to another round of World Superpowers. In the first round, we compared the US and Chinese military prowess. The US easily won that round, but China's catching up fast. This time round, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are squaring up once again. But this time, they're trading blows with WFDs, weapons of financial destruction. So, what strengths and weaknesses do they have? Well, America imports more than $500 billion worth of goods from China compared to China's $130 billion from the US. Because the US imports more, it has greater scope to add tariffs on Chinese goods, and therefore can attack for harder and longer. So far, Trump has fired off $34 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese imports, things like steel, aluminium, medical equipment, aircraft parts, and batteries. The Chinese have retaliated measure for measure with their own tariffs on $34 billion worth of US goods. They targeted soybeans, beef, and off-road vehicles. So now Trump is threatening two further waves of tariffs on another $416 billion worth of goods if the Chinese continue to retaliate. That would be pretty much using up all his firepower. China's ceiling is obviously much lower, but while they might not be able to match the US on tariffs, China can allow its currency to weaken sharply, making their goods even cheaper for Americans to buy and somewhat offsetting the effects of Trump's tariffs. So what's the damage from all of this? well, US and Chinese consumers will have to pay eventually more for certain products. In the US, Coca-Cola will be putting up its prices because of the tariffs on Chinese aluminium. And while American steelworkers might be celebrating as steel plants reopen thanks to those tariffs on Chinese steel, farmers have been targeted by China in retaliation and are not so happy. So it's Trump to the rescue with a $12 billion subsidy shield. But how long will that last them? Meanwhile, in China, stocks have fallen so heavily that Chinese stock markets have moved from being the second biggest in the world to the third biggest, behind the US and Japan. Although it's hard to tell how much of that damage is down to the trade war and how much is because of domestic factors. Still, trade wars are complex and the effects often take years to be felt. But so far, both players are looking rather worse for wear. Back to Steve Tsang now. Steve, if we continued with this sort of military metaphor, who has the greater firepower in this?
Well, I think the United States clearly has greater firepower. The US economy is much bigger and is much more vibrant and stronger economy. But I think focusing on that perhaps misses the point. The point really is about the pain threshold, who can take more punishment. And here I think the democratic system that the United States has put it at a disadvantage compared to the very strong, hard authoritarian system that China has. Because if Xi Jinping says that China has to take the punishment, China will take the punishment, even though it means people have to be tightening their belts, company collapsing. They can survive that. It will be much more difficult for the US administration to do that.
That's a really interesting point, Steve. Howard, I want to come to you. Exactly as Steve said, in the United States, we have the congressional midterm elections coming up, and the Chinese know that, of course. They also know that people like you, farmers, are important to Donald Trump's voting base. So what I wanted to ask you about this pain threshold, has it been reached yet? Are American farmers going to turn on Donald Trump? Or will they stick with him for a little while longer?
Oh, yeah, they'll stay with him for a while longer. I think patience is the key here. And like Steve mentioned, China can probably weather the storm a lot longer, a lot more patient with their regime than we can. I do see the farmers hanging on in there, especially with the $12 billion bailout. That's going to suffice.
Yeah, let me explain that to the viewers then. When China retaliated and put tariffs on farmers, American farmers, Donald Trump then came in and said, I will give you $12 billion to shield you from China. Well, that is going to last, is it, for a little while?
Sure. I mean, that's going to soothe some of the hurt, but it's not, if it continues, it's where the problem is going to arise. And the farmer's not looking for a bailout. We're not really, we just want fair markets at this point. That would last for a while, but it won't.
Greg, as an arch capitalist, this transfer of $12 billion to protect your own farmers is actually not something you're in favor of, right?
No, we want trade, not aid. I mean, I don't think farmers want aid. I think they want to just have free and fair open markets and free trade. So look, I thought that was a disaster when the president came in and took $12 billion of taxpayer money and gave it to an industry that he, in fact, is responsible for creating the problem. And frankly, in the long run, I totally agree with Howard. It's going to hurt the farmers in the long run. Transfer payments are never effective.
Greg, I just want to get back to this idea of firepower. A lot of people say that President Donald Trump has chosen a relatively good time to play this game of poker, because take a look at his hand. We've got, for example, the economy growing at 4.1% the last quarter. We also have unemployment down at a historical low there for 3.9%. Hasn't been that low, well, for about 18 years or so. And then the stock market is at an all-time high or near an all-time high. This is the time, isn't it, for Donald Trump to play tough with China?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, things are going so well for the U.S. economy. The deregulation has been effective. The tax reform has been effective. So in a sense, he's playing with the House's money. The economy is killing it on all cylinders. So yeah, maybe it is a good time to play with that a little bit. I think it's a mistake. I wish that basically tariffs are a tax on the consumer. They're a tax on the private sector. I wish he wouldn't do it. But it's the Trump way, and oddly enough, sometimes it works. I don't necessarily agree with the tariffs, but you bring up a good point, Matthew. It's probably a good time to do it.
Steve, I just want to come back to you on a point you raised, the pain threshold. We know that, of course, the president and various congressmen and women have to answer to the people through the democratic system. But what about China? There was a time when economists said China has to grow between 6 and 7% to prevent social unrest. I don't know if you ever agreed with that.
Well, China will still need to maintain a relatively high degree of growth in order to secure stability in the country. And therefore, if the Chinese economy slows down, as is likely to as a result of the trade conflict with the United States, then the Chinese government will have to go back to what they have always done, which is to invest more in infrastructure in order to keep the economy growing at a respectable rate and stabilize the economy. Now, that will store up long-term problems for the Chinese economy. That will pile up even more, and the economy will get more risky in the longer term. But if we're talking about a time frame of the next 6 months, 12 months, a year or so, they probably will get away with it.
Back to you quickly, Howard. Somebody wrote that farmers can stick with Trump so long as it's all resolved by harvest time. Now, everyone has a different season around the world, so harvest time for you guys is something around about the midterm elections time, right?
That is correct. October, late October, sometime into November.
Right.
Just depending on the part of the country that you're living in.
Yeah.
Sure.
Of course, the Chinese know that, so we'll see how they play their hand. But, you know, come the midterm elections, people like Howard will have a choice between the Democrats and the Republicans. Thing is, even Trump's Democratic rivals, people like Chuck Schumer, believe something must be done about China. Listen to this.
I believe that the president's instincts to go after China are the right thing to do. I think China has taken terrible advantage of America over the last decade or two, and they don't play fair. The trouble, we don't know what the details will be, so I don't want to make any final comment, but it seems initially it's not well targeted. It seems to have a greater negative effect on Canada and Europe than on China. So they ought to make sure what they do is focused on China. They are our #1 trade problem, not Canada, not Europe.
All right, well, we'll focus on China. Let's try to work out if this war is worth fighting. Trump and many others, like Chuck there, say China's been cheating at trade for years, and its success has come at a grave cost to US businesses and workers. Here are some of his main complaints.
But we have one particular problem, and that's China. It is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. We have a tremendous intellectual property theft situation. When they charge 25% for a car to go in, and we charge 2% for their car to come into the United States, that's not good. Just use the word reciprocal. If they charge us, we charge them the same thing.
Well, let's go to Steve Tsang for a bit of analysis. Steve, are Trump's complaints actually valid?
Well, the point about reciprocity is absolutely right. I think that is the heart of the problem. Where I think Trump is wrong is to focus the issue of reciprocity on tariff. There are not that many American-made, US-made cars that are exported to China. There are not that many Chinese-made cars which are exported to the United States either. American car companies mostly manufacture in China for the Chinese market. Those are not being affected by the
What should he
tariff.
focus on then?
The focus really should be on the issue of reciprocity across the board in the economic relationship, including trade. US and Western companies operating in China do not operate on a level playing field with Chinese companies. We need to have a situation where restrictions on investments and other kind of pressure being put on Western companies in China in terms of intellectual properties need to be addressed.
So, for example, American companies have historically not been able to go into China and buy up more than, say, 50%, take control of those companies. That's going to be changing in a couple of years. Is that right?
Well, the Chinese government, as a result of the Trump's initiative, have agreed that moving forward in the next couple of years, say American car companies in China in joint venture operations can own up to about 50% of their operations in China. So that is going to happen in about 2 years' time. It's not yet happening. I think what we do really have a problem here is that if American companies are not allowed to own a majority share in China, then Chinese companies cannot expect to be able to buy American companies above 50% level. Or in fact, we should have both restrictions being lifted. That's what I think we need to do.
Well, that's the other issue. It's about restricting Chinese investment in the United States. And again, hasn't Donald Trump done that as part of his trade war with China?
Well, Donald Trump has done that. But the issue is you have a general approach towards allowing both sides to have much better access, which will then benefit everybody concerned.
Greg, we've heard about steel tariffs and soybeans and so on, but this is just one part of the trade war mosaic, if you like. Donald Trump and many, many people in his administration, both sides of the political aisle, are primarily concerned about the future, which is intellectual property, especially in the technology sectors. Is this the right way to go about protecting U.S. intellectual property?
Well, something has to be done. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. is 16 for 16 with the WTO. Obviously, China is violating. They're stealing IP. We went through this a month or two ago with ZTE, and the Obama administration also went through with ZTE. It's clear that they're stealing IP. That has to be fixed.
What's the best way to target that? Either of you, Steve, Greg?
There's a lot of ways to do it, without putting punitive tariffs on our friendly trading partners.
Taking them through the World Trade Organization hasn't done it so far, has it? I mean, there's still cyber theft and other ways of taking it.
It's a really good point. I mean, I think that how many times do you go back to the table to the WTO without finally realizing this is not going to solve the problem?
How do you protect intellectual property without using a blunt instrument like tariffs?
Well, you are talking about very many different things in terms of the protection of intellectual properties. You have the economic espionage, which is happening. That has to be dealt with in a more conventional way of how you deal with economic espionage. You also have the issue of the Chinese government putting pressure on American companies operating in China to give up their intellectual property rights to the Chinese competitors in order to be allowed to operate in China. Now, that's something I think the U.S. government really should focus on and take up with the Chinese authorities. And there are a lot of family members of the top Chinese leadership who are in the United States with business operations. I think that is where you put the pressure and make it very clear to the Chinese government. You squeeze an American technology company in China to get their intellectual property rights, then your family members will be punished.
Okay. I just want to talk about protecting intellectual property. It comes at a cost, and we know that because the highly respected Wall Street economist Peter Boockvar, well, he wrote, if protecting U.S. intellectual property is the ultimate goal here, I'm not sure how destroying shareholder wealth and making the American farmer the main sacrificial lamb is going to get us there. Howard, I have to come to you. As Boockvar said, the farmers are the sacrificial lamb here. Do you feel like that sometimes?
I really do. I think we are. And with the $12 billion bailout, that'll pacify us for a while. But as time goes on, it will determine, are we really willing to be sacrificed?
Greg, just want to round this off, take it back to the people, the consumers. Obviously, everybody's affected, but let's look at the American consumers. Is it already feeding into their household bills?
I don't think it's dramatic yet. I think there's some exaggerations in terms of the impact. I mean, look, you remember for one of the major products that we're disputing here is soybeans. Soybeans are traded globally. It's a fungible product. It's similar to oil in that sense. If we open up the EU markets, if the EU's buying the soybeans, I don't imagine the farmers and the traders care who they're selling it to as long as they're selling it.
Greg, thank you for that. Well, just one more nugget before we go. For those of you who think Trump isn't consistent, He is on some issues. Here's a clip from exactly 30 years ago when he was interviewed by Oprah. He was talking about Japan, but similar principle.
We let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
Probably not.
Probably not, but hey, 30 years later, we've got President Trump now. Looks like Oprah was right. Well, Howard Gunn, thank you very much for joining us in the Nexus. Greg Swanson also, and also Steve Tsang, thank you. Well, that's it. That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching. If you want to see this episode, any bits of it that you like in particular, or the previous episodes, take a look at our YouTube channel over there. In the meantime, thank you for watching. See you soon.